By way of introducing our next segment, a couple years ago, I was at a progressive conference, a Netroots Nation conference, and at dinner with a group of people one night, I said, I don't know if I can bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And someone turned to me with the most intense imaginable sneer possible and said, don't you think you're being irresponsible? And my answer was, how am I being irresponsible? I'm giving you 3 years notice. If I'm that important, do something about it. Now, 2 of those 3 years have passed. Our next guest has waded into that controversy in a much more public way. Shane Ryan is a writer who covers everything from sports to politics. His new book is Slaying the Tiger, A Year Inside the Ropes on the new PGA Tour. And he has also written recently in Salon about whether or not progressive or left or socialist or Bernie Sanders voters should in fact vote for Hillary Clinton should she be the nominee in 2016. So Shane, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. Now, first of all, let's just start by people may be curious about your book. Tell us just briefly what your book's about.
Yeah, so the book, which came out earlier this summer, is basically what the title says. I spent a year inside the ropes on the PGA Tour and followed, the best players. The theory being that golf is in a transitional stage where Tiger Woods is kind of fading away and a whole new generation of superstars is taking over. So I wanted to, track that trend, and I hope it came true, and it did in a big way. And I wanted to talk about golf in a way that was different from the kind of soft coverage that is really typical of sports media. So that was the book, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for a week, which was great. And I am biased, but I think it would be an excellent Christmas present for the golf lover in your family.
Well, you got that in just in time because the Amazon page for it says it will arrive before Christmas if you order now. So congratulations on that. Now, well done. Now, let's talk about your article in Salon, your commentary in Salon, which I imagine got a lot of attention. It got a typically colorful Salon headline assigned to it, "Just Let the Republicans Win. Maybe things need to get really bad before America wakes up." Now, you and I both have written for Salon. We know the author does not necessarily choose the headline. But what was the premise of that piece?
So, yeah, the premise of the piece, I'm a avowed Bernie Sanders supporter, and I've actually read a number of essays lately saying, from the left, from the progressive left, saying I will not vote for Hillary. And largely they're issues-based. They say this is why I don't like Hillary Clinton, and this is why I do like Bernie Sanders. And that all made sense to me. And then the response to that, obviously, from centrist Democrats is that we don't want a Republican to be president, and by not voting for Hillary, you're helping make that possible. And so what I wanted to do was look at it from a slightly different strategic angle. And I should say that I'm undecided about what I'll do in the general election if Hillary does win the primary. But I wanted to look at it and see, is there any kind of strategic argument to be made that actually it would be a good thing not to vote for Hillary, and it might even be a good thing for the country in the long term if a Republican were to win. And I wanted to counterbalance that with, obviously, from the left, I think that it would be, in the short term, a bad thing, obviously, if a Republican were to win. But was there a long-term argument that maybe it would benefit us in some way in the long run?
What struck me about your piece, Shane, was that, first of all, I've made this argument myself at various points, raised this issue in the same way over the course of a year. First of all, in every time, at least once a show, I let our listeners know that I do work for Bernie Sanders, so, it's kind of conflict of interest note that I make there. But I have raised the question before, the exact same question, and I did on the program The Young Turks once, I remember. I think it was in 2008 or 2012. Ray, what do you think of that? And Cenk Uygur, who's the host of that show, made what I thought was the most compelling counter-argument to that position, which was, Richard, you're assuming that if the Democrats lose with a conservative, right-leaning candidate, they'll figure out that they need to move left. But no matter what happens, the Democrats conclude they need to move right. So, and he really made me think about that. So, what can you envision as a tactical play that would work out in the long run better for the left if a Republican won in 2016?
And a lot of my argument was framed from the viewpoint of the Democratic Party. I think what happens a lot, and I think what's happening this time, is that they are kind of, in my opinion, strong-arming Hillary Clinton into being the candidate. And right down to the way they're scheduling debates, where all these debates are happening on Saturday nights. It really seems like they learned their lesson from 2007 and 2008 when Obama came from way behind and defeated Hillary. And it seems a little bit like they're taking progressive voters for granted. They're running a centrist candidate who, in my opinion, is very tied in with Wall Street and big business and everything else. And they're saying, we're not going to worry about the far left because inevitably they are going to come back in the general election because they're going to be scared of the Republicans. And so my thinking is that if that doesn't work, if Hillary does win the nomination, but the far left says, listen, we're not voting for this candidate whose ideals we don't agree with, and we're not going to let the fear of a Republican dictate our vote, that could force the Democratic Party into next time saying, okay, we need to actually represent the left of this country, and we need to have someone who is not just socially liberal, but also economically liberal and liberal in foreign policy as well. So I can see it producing a better candidate in the future. And now as to your question as whether the voters would learn, I do think there is some historical precedent for that. I do think Obama, even though he turned out not to be the most progressive president ever, I do think people believe that he might be, whether or not he promised that. I think they thought he would, and I think the popularity that surrounded him was due in part to the negative feeling toward George W. Bush's presidency. And I think you can look at somebody like FDR, who, in my opinion, is a model for what we need right now, and say that the economic policies of the Republicans in the 1920s kind of led the way for someone like that to take over and push through the New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, and made the New Deal necessary. We're talking with writer Shane Ryan. Yeah, just to be clear, by the way, Shane, I'm not saying that it's the voters who wouldn't learn the right lesson. I'm saying it's the leadership of the Democratic Party, the pundits
Right.
and the politicians and all that who and that was Cenk Uyghur's argument, and I think it has some merit to it. Here's the thing. I think you're absolutely right. I have a friend who's 92 years old and used to produce and direct Meet the Press in the 1950s. And he said,
Oh, wow.
even back then, what Democratic politicians were saying about liberals was where are they going to go? They got no place else to go. They'll come around. So I do think there's something to the notion that what's happened on the Republican side is that the fanatical far right, as opposed to the far right, which is the mainstream Democratic Party, the fanatical far right said, no, we don't care about you, Republican Party. And if you give us another moderate by the standards of the Republican Party, will tear him down. And they primaried, Eric Cantor, who was a hard right Republican who got defeated in a primary by a Tea Partier. So there is something to be said for the question, I guess, do we need a left version of the Tea Party whose allegiance is not to the party, but to the principles?
Yeah, and I think a follow-up on that is that a lot of people, when they hear this argument, they say, well, look, a Republican president is going to be so much worse than Hillary Clinton will be. And I think most of us agree with that. And Bernie Sanders has said that and would agree with that. However, I think when you look at it from the perspective of someone who, like me, who believes that, Bill Clinton took a big step to the right and he pushed the Democratic Party that way, and in some sense maybe abandoned workers and with the free trade agreement really, wasn't super helpful in terms of jobs in America. I think you look at that and say, okay, well, despite the fact that the Republicans are going to be way worse if they're in the presidency, what we're enduring now with candidates like Bill Clinton and with someone like Hillary Clinton is this slow bleed that is really not much better, and it's just sort of bringing things to the same place but slower. And like you said, it's now or never in some ways. If the progressive left is going to make itself heard, it really needs to be a separate thing who stands up and says, this is not something that we can tolerate. Otherwise, this slow bleed keeps happening. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether it happens, in 20 years or whether a Republican ruins the country in 4 years. It's just one of those things that the change needs to happen now.
We're talking with writer Shane Ryan, and something to support your slow bleed theory. I would argue would be the presidency of Bill Clinton, who went along with deregulation of Wall Street, which eventually had catastrophic results, went along with so-called welfare reform, which we now know, as many predicted, had terrible impact especially for impoverished single mothers, but for many people, children and parents in poverty. And did not force people to get jobs, because you can't force people to get jobs that don't exist. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, but I think that the counter argument that really makes people sometimes stop in their tracks, and you mentioned in your piece, I think, is the Supreme Court. What about that?
Yeah, it's true. There's a possibility that the next president, even if he or she were only to serve 4 years, could appoint 2 to 3 new Supreme Court justices. It's just, I don't have, it's a very compelling argument, and this is part of the reason why I'm undecided, why I'm not coming down firmly on saying that I'll never vote for Hillary in the general election. But for me, again, it comes down to what is the most important thing. And, you start to get the feeling, and I mentioned this in the end of my piece, that there's always an excuse. There's always a reason not to vote with your ideals, and for the progressive left not to unite and sort of demand that the Democratic candidate be one of their own. So this time it's the Supreme Court. There'll be a compelling reason next time because, maybe the economy will be going in the tank, or there'll be the possibility of a war, which there is now, actually. So it just feels wrong, and it feels like a defensive mentality to vote out of fear. And this idea that our time, the progressive time, is sometime in the future is one that repeats over and over to the point that you just stop believing it, and you start to think, well, you can't wait. No matter what the excuse is, waiting is not going to be helpful anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something to be said also for the spiraling down of the political process. The more and more this happens, the constant movement to the right as well. But Shane Ryan, I'm going to offer a way out of this whole debate. I'm going to argue, and I want to get your thoughts on this. I'm going to argue, and I have argued, in fact, that this whole debate, which I've engaged in, which you've engaged in a sense, is a sideshow. And here's what I mean. In the end, the cohort that is Shane Ryan, Richard RJ Eskow, whomever else is on the fence about this whole thing or troubled by this whole process, is basically relatively small compared to the millions and millions of people who don't vote, even in presidential elections, much less in off-year elections. So I think the way out of it is by saying that people like you and I, who are troubled by voting for people that don't seem to really represent what we stand for, we're kind of like the canaries in the coal mine for all those other people out there who already aren't voting, and by not voting are helping the Republicans and hurting the Democrats. So really, my argument, I want to know what you think about it, is that by pleasing the Shane Ryans of the world, and the Bernie Sanders voters of the world, a lot of whom would vote for Hillary anyway, but by pleasing them, you're also going to bring new people to the polls and new energy to the political process, and that's what's really going to help the Democrats in the long run. But if they don't get wise to that, even if they win the presidency in 2016, they're going to keep losing in Congress, they're going to keep losing the state houses, and on and on and on.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate comedy behind this claim that Bernie Sanders is unelectable and that Hillary Clinton is somehow more electable. Beyond the fact that when they do polls where they say, Hillary versus Rubio, Hillary versus Trump, and then they do the same thing with Sanders, he wins all those, and he's won those for months now. So that by itself, the numbers show that he's more electable. But what you said, I think, is even more important. If you don't have a candidate with enthusiasm, you're not going to get the turnout. And as we all know, and it's shown by midterm elections over and over, low turnout benefits Republicans, and it always does.
Right.
And so even if Hillary were to win this time, you can bet that there's going to be a lot of similarity to the Obama presidency, which is that she's going to face an obstructionist Congress, just like Bernie would. And she's going to have trouble getting things done. She's going to make a perfect scapegoat. The Republicans already hate her, and their voters really dislike her too. And it's going to be the same situation where in 2020 maybe she loses or maybe she keeps winning, but you're going to see the Republicans, just like you said, continue to control the state house, which means, of course, they can continue to gerrymander
Right.
for the last 10 more years. And that, honestly, in terms of legislation and policy, I think that you could easily argue that has an even bigger impact than whatever's going to happen with the Supreme Court, which is already conservative. So, yeah, I 100% fall in line with your argument there, and I think, the crowds he's gotten and everything shows that if you want a mobilized left with new voters coming in, I mean, Sanders is the candidate. He just is.
Well, that platform is the platform to back. People want broader Social Security. People want more jobs. People want stronger wages, higher minimum wage, and so on. So, all right, Shane Ryan, you wrote a very provocative and interesting piece, and author of the book "Slaying the Tiger: A Year Inside the Ropes on the New PGA Tour." Last question: how many people flamed you on Twitter without actually bothering to read the piece itself, just on the basis of the title alone?
Yeah, well, I'll give some people credit. I think about 15% read the piece and then flamed me, and I think probably 85% saw the headline and flamed me.
That's my usual ratio for writing for Salon too. So anyway,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly.
Great to have you on the program, Shane Ryan, and we appreciate it.